What's up, guys? It's Brandon Flash. Today you're joining me in my Model Y, and we're going to be talking about the time advantage of using a version 3 supercharger, 250 kilowatt, or whether it actually makes a difference if you go to a version 2 150 kilowatt supercharger in your Model Y or Model 3. So for this test, I actually went and did 2 charge recordings. I did 10 to 80% on a version 4 post, version 3 cabinet Tesla supercharger, so up to 250 kilowatts, 600 plus amps native, boost to over 900 amps for a Cybertruck, or for a Model Y or Model 3, about 700 or so amps. And also a version 2 supercharger, so a version 2 that displayed up to 150 kilowatts. We saw about 141 kilowatts and can deliver about 400 amps in its boost function. I believe about 250 continuous, but we did this test on a pretty cool day, so we didn't run into any of those limitations. So this is kind of best case scenario. I also made sure to have the batteries preconditioned, so that way the batteries were warm and in their optimal temperature for charging. And then we also, on the version 2, made sure that I wasn't sharing power with the other stall, so we'll get into that in a moment. But we kind of set this up for optimal conditions for both test scenarios. And the vehicle that we're using is my new 2025 Model Y long-range rear-wheel drive that has the Panasonic battery pack. I've done a full charge curve analysis on a version 3. My previous video, both 0 to 100 and 10 to 80. But this is actually using that same 10 to 80 version 3 recording for comparison with the version 2, the 150 kilowatt charger. So let's get into it. I have 2 different recordings that I'm going to be playing for you guys. So let's talk about that. So on the top, you will see the version 2 supercharger, so limited to 150 kilowatts. And below, we will see the version 3 250 kilowatt charger. So let's just get started. You'll see the time is a little bit off on the top. I tried to sync them both up as much as I could to be right as both click to 10%, so we kind of have a common starting point, but that does throw the time off very slightly on the version 2. Reason being that one, I believe, started at 8% and 9%, but as long as we're having it as they both click on to 10%, this should be a solid comparison. And then we also eliminate a little bit of the ramp up time as well. So without further ado, let's get into the charge recording. So on top, you'll see it shoots right up to 140 kilowatt, bottom about 250 kilowatt. And you'll see that it ramps down pretty quickly on the bottom one, whereas the top version 2 will still continue to hold that 140-ish kilowatts for quite a while. We do see the version 3 taking on a bit of a lead in that beginning. But we're going to be quickly actually below 200 kilowatts, which kind of takes away some of that advantage. And then as we continue to get into this, we're actually going to see that the version 2 will hold power a bit longer than the version 3 supercharger. Right now we're at about a 7% gap. I believe that is about the peak gap that will hold. And then it will actually start to shrink that gap as we go on throughout this test. And again, this is a 10 to 80, so I think this is pretty representative of a normal road trip stop. And then as we're here, so we're at about a 9% gap now as we get about 8 minutes in, and we're now at 143 kilowatts at 41% on the version 3, which means that we're actually at the same point as the version 2 supercharger. So if you plug in above about 43%, it doesn't matter if you're on a version 2 or a version 3. And then you'll see that the version 3 actually dipped early. So because of the extra thermal load and heat that's generated by the charging at higher power on the version 3, it's actually dropping a bit earlier than it will on the version 2 as far as this. And then I'll also have some graphs at the end that really kind of illustrate this for you guys. We're still just humming along at 140-ish kilowatts. Now we're dropping below that at about 45%. So we did hold that again a bit longer than we did on the version 3. And then that gap is starting to shrink a little bit. We're down to 7% gap about 15 minutes in. We're at 50% at 15-ish minutes on the version 2, and about 55% at 15 minutes on the version 3. So again, a pretty small gap overall. And then we're just going to keep on plugging along here. And then as we keep going on, you'll see that gap is shrinking. We're now down to a 6% gap at 56 and 62. 57, 62 said 5% there. And then they'll kind of just keep holding pretty close. And then the gap won't actually go away fully, but we will see that gap shrink a bit and kind of hold throughout the rest of the test. Basically, as you're going along on these charging stops on a road trip, the higher you plug in, the less it matters what speed the charger you're at is, because of Tesla's charging curve and how peaky it is. So you really have to be at a low state of charge to take advantage of the higher charging rates. Otherwise, you're just going to end up not even using it at all. Especially if the version 3 site is full, you may not see it even. So here we are still, now we're down to 4%, 3%-ish gap at 68 and 71%. And then it's just both slowing down pretty dramatically. We're down below 80 kilowatts on both, 73 at 70 on the version 2, and 61 at 74 on the version 3. Because the version 3 does have more thermal load on the battery, which does make an impact on how long it can hold that charging speed. And then we're still just plugging along. We're going to be crossing over 30 minutes here shortly. And you'll see that over the course of the 30-minute charging session, we'll end up with less than a 5% difference in range added, or final range that we end up at. And then here we are crossing just about to 80% on the version 3 below. And that crossed it at 3103, whereas the version 2 is at about 77%. But again, we started at about 36 seconds on here. So we're at a very small gap here. And realistically, in the real world, 78 versus 80% is pretty small difference in actual driving. And then we're going to be coming up on that 80% for the version 2. So here we are. We had about a 35-minute, or just shy of 35 minutes, but actually about 34:30 on the version 2. And on the version 3, we're at about just over 31 minutes. So over the course of a 10 to 80% charging session, so adding over 55-ish kilowatt hours on a long range Model 3 or Model Y. Again, these charge curves are the same whether you have a Model 3 or Model Y, as long as you have the new Panasonic battery pack. You're only saving about 3.5 minutes over the course of that full 10 to 80% charging session. Of course, if you unplug earlier, then you may have a bit of a larger advantage to the version 3. But the deeper you charge, the less that gap will be, especially if you're charging to 90% for whatever reason. But if you're charging from 5%, for example, then you'll have a little bit more of a gap on that version 3. Anyway, in conclusion, here we have some graphs. So we'll start off with just plotting both of the charge curves. So we have the blue is version 3, the red is version 2. So you can see that very flat line on the version 2 and kind of the higher peak, but not a very long holding of it, and then the gradual drop on the version 3. Here we have the difference in charger power and highway range over time. So on the left, you'll see that the version 3 holds a pretty large advantage initially, and then it actually crosses over to a version 2 advantage throughout the minutes of charging of the session. And you can see in the pink, the amount of added range advantage to the version 3 versus the version 2 as you get throughout that charging session and how that shrinks. And then here we have over SOC, so state of charge for each battery percentage. So again, early in the charge session, the version 3 has an advantage with those blue bars. And then as we get towards that crossover at about 43% or so, we actually cross over to the version 3 having an advantage for charging power throughout the entire charging session. You'll also see the time difference there as well. So overall, in conclusion, the time difference between version 2 and version 3 is pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things, especially if you're on a road trip that's only 1 or 2 charging stops. That 3 or 6 minutes is not going to make any meaningful impact to your trip. The things that will make a bigger impact to your trip are if you're going to a version 2 that you'll have to share power. So with a version 2 supercharger, if you're parked next to someone that you're sharing power with, you can tell this because there's usually like a 1A, 1B. So that A and B pair will share power. They're not always laid out to be next to each other. Sometimes it might be all the A's and then all the B's. So definitely pay attention to that. But the other thing is that it could be dependent on the location off the highway of some of these chargers. So if the version 2 is closer to the highway, use that. If the version 3 is closer to the highway, use that. But also pay attention to the utilization of the sites, because if it's a version 2 that's really heavily utilized and 8 out of 10 stalls are full, you're likely going to share power, and it's going to be a worse experience than if you went to a version 3 site with similar capacity. But version 3 has site level power sharing, so you could end up derated, but it's less likely to be as noticeable as a version 2 that you're sharing power, because version 2, it's simply a fixed split of 50-50 if you're sharing power, versus on the version 3, it's fully dynamic between all the stalls on the entire site. So let me know what you guys think. If you haven't already, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment down below with your thoughts. See you guys on the next one. Thank you guys for watching.